My name's Lillian Kleingartner. I now go by Lil Ward. Grew up on a farm 11 miles south of Gackle for the first 11 years of my life. And then when my dad died, we moved into town, into this house. And when I got married, we moved to Minneapolis. And we've lived there most of our married life, except when he got transferred to Fargo for 4 months, and then we moved back to Minneapolis.
Best 4 months of your life. But okay, um, now we're going to get into some of the things that we talked about earlier about activities on the farm. So you lived on the farm until you were about 11 years old. What are some of the activities you as a young girl on the farm would have done?
The one that I remember the most is weeding and hoeing the garden. And I was the youngest of 10 kids. I'm not sure my oldest brother was still at the farm when I was born. I'm not sure when he left the farm. But there were 10 of us. So there was a lot of weeding in the garden. Then I had to help milk when the boys weren't able to, because there were 2 girls and 8 boys. So we didn't have to help a lot on the farm, except for that and the three-legged stool that you sat on when you milked and hoped you didn't fall over. Remember butchering chickens, especially when our German relatives came over here, and then they stayed with us and then lived in Gackle and moved to Jamestown, and they come out to butcher chickens. And we talk about this even this weekend while we were up here. You butchered the chickens in the morning and cleaned them and cooked them up and ate them in the evening. Now, I'm not sure any of us could do that now. It'd be a little gross for us to butcher a chicken and then have to eat it the same day. We're used to going to the store and just buying it.
Now you were the youngest, so do you think you had different activities? First of all, because you were young, and then maybe because you were a girl.
Yes, absolutely. Had we been boys, we would have been out there doing everything that the boys did. We were never allowed to go out in the barn and see a calf born or the castration of the cattle or any of that because we were girls. So we were very much, we didn't have to do the separating unless the boys were out in the field. And I was the youngest. I didn't have to do that a lot. But very definitely, we were treated as girls. They
Okay.
tell me I was spoiled, so maybe I was.
What activities then would the girls, and not just you, but the girls on the farm, what sort of were your assigned duties or chores?
You had to go and get the eggs from the chicken coop, which you hated to do because the chickens pecked at you. Um, the cattle or the cows and the chickens were free roaming, so you always had to watch that you didn't step in the pies, the dirt when you went. I remember having a few times to feed the pigs, but again, if the boys were there, it was a heavier job and they had to do it. We had to help Mom with the laundry and hanging it up outside, bringing it in off the lines, which wasn't always easy because there was always wind. Um, Not sure. I have to think about it again.
Hmm. What about cooking? Did your mom teach you how to cook, or
I
did
was 11 years old when we left the farm, and I don't think either one of us ever cooked out there. Once we moved to town, we did a lot of the cooking. But while we lived on the farm, no, we just had to help Mom take the food out to the threshers. My dad had a big threshing machine and a lot of boys to help him, so he started at 5:30 in the morning and had a big breakfast when he left, and then mid-morning you had to take out sandwiches and water and coffee and pickles. I always had pickles. And then something sweet. I'm not sure that he got sweets in the morning, because when my mom made it was raised donuts and kuchen and that type of thing, and that you weren't able to do just a few hours in the morning. But then they'd come home for a big meal at noon. My dad would lay down for half an hour or thereabouts and take a nap. Then they go back out, and mid-afternoon, again, you took them some food until they came in when it got dark. And I remember liking to do that, going out, and it was a dirty job. Everybody was so glad to see the water jugs and the pickles. I don't know if that's because it was so hot out there, and I'm not sure, but I just know pickles were always part of it.
now you said you moved to town when you were 11. What were the differences between, and you can even talk about school as well, what were the differences between living on the farm and then all of a sudden living in town?
It was very traumatic. My dad died, and then we moved to town. I'd gone to school for 6 years at Klein School, which was a mile from the house, mile and a half. I think it was a mile. Anyway, sometimes we had to walk. Being the baby, Dad often got us or took us, and I only had to walk one way. And my brother Pete, he often had to carry me, and I thank him for that every now and then because I know I wasn't able to. But the farm kids, I mean, there were four in my grade, which was one of the biggest ones. That was your family. You know, you got to knowing them, and all of a sudden, the other family that we had, other than relatives that were related, was your church family. You know, you knew the kids in your Sunday school and the people in the church, but your school and the church were your family. And then all of a sudden we're uprooted and come into town and we have to meet all these people we don't know. And when I started 7th grade here in Gackle, it was pretty traumatic. And I really wanted to go back to the farm school and wasn't able to, but
So how many kids would, in the farm school, your grades would have been made up of? How many kids and how many, so you had like a couple teachers at school?
couple teachers.
Yeah, I mean, or was there
Oh
only
no,
one teacher?
it was a one-room schoolhouse with one teacher who taught grades 1 through 7, 8, 1 through 8. And my brother was in the 8th grade, and I must have been in about the, I don't know, 3rd grade, 2nd or 3rd grade. And that was, you learned a lot. I really felt like a lot of my education was listening to the older kids, having to do their spelling and their arithmetic and everything else. And then you came to town and I started at junior high, which was hard because then you had to go to different classes and different teachers. And it wasn't just one teacher teaching you. So it was pretty traumatic.
How about language? You told me earlier, and I want you to tell me again, that you spoke quite a bit of German at home. Were you able to speak German? First, tell me you spoke it at home. Then tell me if you were able to speak German in school at all.
We were not allowed to speak German in school, although most of our teachers were German background. But once you went to school, you had to speak English. And I don't think we got punished if every now and then we didn't speak English. But by then, my brothers were all older. I was the youngest, so I spoke English as much as I spoke German. But I did learn German. I knew how to speak German until got married, moved to Minneapolis, and had no one to speak with.
Did your parents speak German at home mainly, or did they speak English?
There's someone who's walking in the background. There, I think they stopped.
Okay. So did your parents speak German at home?
Absolutely. My parents spoke German. My brothers all spoke German. Helen and I, my sister, we didn't speak German all that much. And when you went to Grandma and Grandpa Miller's house, and that's the only grandparents that I ever knew, the others died back in the 20s. But Grandma and Grandpa didn't speak any English. Grandpa finally, by the time he died, he spoke a bit of English, broken. But you pretty much had to talk German to him. So, yes, German.
And then your father sponsored a German family coming over here, so I imagine you spoke German with them.
In 1951, my dad sponsored his oldest sister, Elizabeth Hofer, and her son, Edward Hofer, and his family to come over. And yes, they came to our house in December, very cold day, dark at night, wore dark clothes. I was scared to death. I was a youngster, and we were pretty, through the years, we were pretty sheltered. So this was pretty traumatic for me, and I still remember them walking in, and they were cold and hungry. Had to be 10:30 at night, and it was cold, and everybody's trying to figure out where they're going to sleep, and we already had a house full and brought them in, and there were 3 in a bed. There were 3 boys in one bed, 3 adult boys in the other bed, and 3 girls in the other bed, all in one room. You never thought anything about it. And they lived with us until I believe it was spring, and then they moved into Gackle. And but my dad's sister And one of the girls went over to my uncle's house, which was 2 miles away, and they stayed with them. But it was a fun time. There were some neat things that happened, but it was crowded and we never thought anything of it. I don't ever remember my brother Gordon, who was probably in his 20s, early 20s, complaining about sleeping 3 in a bed. It was just done. It was the way it was. And we still keep in contact with that family, what's left of them. And
What type of farm did you grow up on? I mean, what you talking about crops and cattle? What was on the farm?
on the farm, we had a lot of land that he grew crops on. Don't ask me what kind. I remember just wheat and flax, but I'm sure there was more. We had cattle, we had chickens, we had pigs. They say at one point we had sheep. I don't remember in my time if there were sheep, but always a lot of chickens and a lot of pigs, and they butchered that. I remember my dad grinding up the pig meat and making liver sausage. In it, we had the big house that we lived in and a summer kitchen. And at one time, long before I was born, they had a sod house that they then bought the summer kitchen that they attached to it. So I never saw any part of the sod house. I don't know what they did with it, but they all lived in this one house that was called a summer kitchen, no bedrooms. I don't exactly know how they all got in there. And that we went yesterday, took a drive out, and it's on a farm about 4 miles or something from our farm. And I didn't know that when it had been sold that it went there. And there were 2 buildings on the farm, which is totally gone now, deserted. But there's 2 white buildings, and we weren't sure which one was our old summer kitchen. So my sister-in-law and I went into one of them, and I said, I don't think this is it, because there's steps going upstairs, and we never had steps. And that other one is so small. How they had the family in there, I'm not sure. But then they bought the other house, but in the summer we would go in the summer kitchen and cook there and close up the other with all the windows closed and the drapes closed so it'd stay cool. And my dad would lay on the floor and take his nap, and then pretty soon he'd get up and say, boys, time to go. And then all head out to the fields again. And again, those are wonderful memories.
Do you remember you mentioned the liver sausage? Did your family cook and eat ethnic German food? Do you remember?
Oh, absolutely. That's all we had was German food. You know, we didn't have, if they couldn't grow it or raise it, you didn't eat it. You know, there was no money to buy food, and we were pretty self-sufficient. We didn't have to go to the store except for flour and sugar and that type of thing. But yeah, I remember this big tub and him just getting in with his hands and stirring it all up and then taking a bit and tasting it. Nope, he had to add some more spices. And everybody else tells me that their parents always would fry it and then eat it to see if it tasted right. I don't remember my dad doing that, unless my memory's just not quite correct, but he would just take it and taste it. And so did we. And I still like liver sausage to this day.
What are some of the other foods that you remember eating as a child?
Kuchen, Nepfla. I don't think we had Nepfla as much as we had dumplings and strudels. Again, a lot of it was work intensive, so Mom had a lot to cook for. I don't ever remember having pancakes. We have talked about this recently because I'm sure she couldn't stand there all day making pancakes for them. They were out in the field, they were big eaters. So we had a lot of the German foods. Didn't care for the Nepfla soup. She would make like Rivella soup or something like that, and we didn't like that. But yes.
What type of food would go out to the boys when they were in threshing or out in the fields? What sort of food would you eat in the fields?
In the fields?
You prepared a lot of food to take out to the boys in the field.
Oh, that was always sandwiches. You took lots and lots of sandwiches. I can't tell you what kind. I think they might have bought lunch meat for them, but I don't know. I also don't know what kind of sandwiches we took to school. Most of the kids got peanut butter sandwiches, and that might have been what we had as peanut butter. And Mama always mixed the peanut butter up with Karo syrup. I still like it that way, and I think it's because it stretched the peanut butter. You know, you put in Karo syrup, and it must have been cheap, and then it went a lot further. So I think those were the sandwiches that we took out. And then kuchen and pickles, and I don't think she ever took caramel rolls or anything like that. She made them, but I don't know that we took them out to the field.
So you have done a lot of canning? I mean, your family?
Yes. And again, we didn't have to do a lot of that. Mom did all the canning, and lots of stuff down in the basement. And I always say that my family loves 8 older brothers. They love vegetables, so long as it's corn. Because they really didn't care for a whole lot more besides corn. But we did. We didn't have peas a lot because there's a lot of work to shelling peas, and you don't get a whole lot. But we had beans and carrots and carrot radishes, a lot of leaf lettuce and radishes.
Things you would have raised in your own garden?
Yes, we raised that in our own garden.
Is that the garden you had to weed and hoe?
Yes, right behind the house. You went out the front door and around the side, through the gate, and there was a garden. And right next to it was toward the road, there was a fence that that I remember, other than the working horses before my time, having one horse that was rideable, barely. 2 brothers were able to ride it. Everyone else was bucked off of it. And it was out there, and we weren't supposed to go near the fence because the horse was not very tame.
Now, you talked to me before we got on camera about your grandchildren coming back and people you like to come back. What's the allure of this town and the farm? Why do you continue to come back, and why do you bring your children and grandchildren come back?
I think the reason my grandchildren and children like to come back, Dayton and I, after we got married and had kids, our vacations were usually coming up here because that's all we could afford. And we come up and stay with Mom, and the kids, my girls, we have 3 daughters. They loved coming up and going out to the farms. They never had to do anything there, but they got to knowing their cousins. They got to know my cousins, their children. They just had buddies up here, so they couldn't wait to come up here. So then they passed that on to their kids, and their kids have been coming up here, and they love to come to Grandma Martha's house and play up here. I don't think that they would have lasted a year up here, but they loved coming up for 2 weeks. They could go out to the farms. They walk to the park for themselves, walk to the Tasty Freeze. I mean, we didn't allow them to do that in the cities. You just couldn't. And even now, they love to come out. Our youngest grandson is 13, and he comes up. My brother's takes him out to his son's farm. Last summer, he helped them when they go out and pick up the bales. You can't do that in the cities. So part of that was just being allowed to come up and ride the 4-wheelers. And the older ones, grandkids, don't come up here all that much anymore because Mom and Dad have a cabin in Wisconsin. So that's where weekends are spent now, where they used to spend weekends up here. But there's hunting, so some of them come up in the fall for hunting.
I know that you have relatives in the Twin Cities. I know that you're a member of the North Star chapter. When you all get together, I think maybe things come up about living on the farm, growing up in a farm family. What are the type of things that you guys discuss with each other? What are some of the topics you talk about?
Well, again, it's just basic things that you had to do. And a lot of people in the North Star chapter had to do a lot more work than I did. Again, being the youngest of 10, I didn't have to do a lot of what some of them did, like the cows and the pigs, and hated having to go over and feed the pigs when I did. But just discussing how things were back in the olden days. You know, the olden days used to be Grandma and Grandpa's era. Now it's our background. And so it is talked about. A lot of our people in the chapter are from South Dakota, so very similar experiences.
Well, maybe they made pancakes. I don't know.
I didn't catch that.
Maybe they made pancakes. I don't know.
Maybe they did. And I think some of the families talk about having pancakes, but when there's only 2 kids in the family, you can make pancakes for 3 and 4. But when there's 10 of them, and they each eat 10 of them, I don't think a stove would have held a griddle big enough for that.
Yeah. Chris, when your time period, when your generation on the farm, a lot of those families were large families. I'm sure that when you went to school, some of the kids came from very large families when you were.
And Gackle is kind of split. Back when I was growing up, I always thought it was probably about 50-50. 50% of it, I would say, was German-Russian, maybe a little bit more, and the other was Finnish. So our school was probably almost half Finnish people, and they had very large families. And then the Germans from Russia, some of them were large, but not others. My mom came, she was one of 3, although she had several older brothers or other brothers that passed away, but there were basically 3 that ever grew to manhood and her. But as far as what people ate, the foods were different between the Finnish, and they would talk about theirs, and we talked about ours. We didn't know what they were talking about. They didn't know what we were talking about, but there were the 2 different backgrounds.
So, did your dad come from a large family?
Yes. I think there were 10 of them, maybe 12. I forget. But yes, a very large family. And again, he was the youngest one. But, and that's why he got, the farm that I grew up on was Grandpa Kleingartner's farm that he homesteaded when he came over. And my dad inherited that. And so we grew up in Grandpa Kleingartner's farm. But their family was pretty much in this area, but they all split. Our family didn't. My family, brothers and sisters, pretty much stayed in this area. The older boys all had farms, and the others, once they had some schooling, they kind of went off elsewhere. But he was the youngest of theirs.
Is there anything we haven't talked about that you made little notes on that you'd like to share with us?
Well, the one thing I remember is Sundays. You always had to go to church, and we were lucky enough to have 2 cars. So even though we had a lot of people, and I'm sure that wasn't always true, but I remember having 2 cars, coming to church, being well-dressed. Sometimes the preacher was invited to Sunday dinners. And then you'd sit and visit in the afternoon. My dad wasn't very outgoing. Mom would have gone 24 hours a day if she could have. So it was really hard for him to go visiting, but you went visiting on Sunday afternoons or Sunday evenings. And it was just fun to go and visit the cousins and get to know them and that type. So Sundays were very special. Going town Saturday nights, that was fun. And as we got older, it was still fun. But about the early 60s, when we got married and moved to Minneapolis, that walking the streets at night quit. The guys driving the cars around quit. I mean, there were so many things in that one era that just kind of died out. But it was so much fun, and going into they had a 5 and dime here in town, going in, and maybe we only got to spend 2 cents on something, but that type of thing. And so Dad would usually come home if he went to town with a goodie for us, something, little piece of candy or whatever. But getting back to the school, we had so much fun in that school. One-room schoolhouse. They had beautiful windows on the east side of the school, and it's still out there, about a half mile or so, or just some feet from where it was. And it's being used now. It had a big front door put in it so he can bring his machinery in. And the windows are gone. I often wonder what happened to those big, beautiful windows. But the last couple of years that I was out there, we had a teacher who loved music, and Mom had donated her old organ to the school. So we had the second oldest brother that was in there, Ed. He could play by ear, and so could one of the other students. So they play polkas and waltzes on our lunch hour and recess, and sometimes the teacher would allow us to push the desks to the side and dance. And that's where I learned how to dance. And then afterwards, you had to put them back. And if we weren't good, we never got to do it for a few days. But the school was a very enjoyable time for me until I came into town. There were always 4 kids in my class the whole time, and then I had to wait for them to join me here in town. I wrote a story about my one-room schoolhouse in the chapter book or anthology that we just did for the North Star chapter, Watermelons and Thistles. And I have a picture in there with that beautiful side of the school, with all of us kids around the pole or something in the snow. But it just shows the windows.
Now, is the farm you grew up on, is that still active?
No. No, my brother kept it up for a few years, and then he wasn't able to, and they weren't able to sell it because it was the biggest farm around. Nobody could afford to buy it. So the barns were sold off, the machine shed was sold off, the house, the big house and the big house fell into the ground. But the summer kitchen was sold off. So they sold what they could. What's out there right now is the granary and a windmill, and you can see where the house was.
Is it possible for us to go down there with you? And
If you
walk
like to.
around a little bit?
I asked my nephew, he owns the property now, and he said, you go for it. I said, do you have cattle in there? And he said, nope, the gate's open waiting for you. But he said there are bee boxes. So we may not want to walk up to the granary because they're between the, he said you can do it, but it's at your own risk. So yes.